this is Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. My guest today is a Zimbabwean author who was recognised as one of the 39 most promising writers from Africa under the age of 40. She received the Rockefeller Foundation's prestigious Bellagio Centre Literary Arts Residency Award for her work in 2017. Her previous novel, House of Stone, was longlisted for the 2019 Rathbones Folio Prize and shortlisted for the 2019 Orwell Prize for Political Fiction. She's won other countless awards and been nominated for many more. Her new book is Digging Stars. I am so pleased to welcome Novuyo Rosa Tshuma. Welcome to Meet the Writers.
It's such an honour, Georgina. Thank you for having me. It's lovely to see you again. It's lovely to be in London talking to you.
Well, and it's so great for me to have a compatriot in the studio.
I mean, it's been great to reminisce old times and dream Zimbabwe in the short time we've been together.
Absolutely. We last met in Washington, of course, where we were both participating in a festival at Georgetown University.
Yes, and that was a lovely gathering. It was great to connect with you then later on to be able to connect with you again here.
So, of course, we have this shared background, which is Zimbabwe, but there's one big difference between us, which is I was born before 1980, which, of course, was independence, and you were born afterwards. Now, you are what Zimbabweans call born free. Tell us what that means.
I mean, born free was always used in Zimbabwe, mostly by ZANU-PF, to shut up the younger generation, to let us know that we had not fought for our freedom, that we should feel grateful for being free, and that we had no say in the running of the country. It's a really tired trope. I think it's really good to reclaim that. Born free, meaning we're grateful for the independence, but we're now free to move on and build a more liberal society.
And do you think we're seeing echoes of this now across Africa? We're looking at the unrest in Kenya and Uganda, now in Nigeria too. Is this the born frees finally saying we're fed up of the old guard? We're not constrained by that politics of liberation any longer?
Certainly. But now I think it's also up to the powers that be in SADC and in other places to support the young people, right? We do know our government, the new military government, has a history of violent repression using the army on the streets, right, which differed from Mugabe using the police on the streets. And I have no doubt that our government would not hesitate to crush that sort of uprising without any pressure from outside.
Of course, both our childhoods have been absolutely marred by violence and by war. You were born after the war, but still that kind of intergenerational damage exists. I lived through it with constant reminders that the country was just being riven in two. But you grew up in Matabeleland, which of course is completely different from growing up in Mashonaland. I wonder if you just explain that difference to our listeners.
I mean, it's so interesting. Growing up, I was born in 1988, so this was actually just a year after the peace agreement, after the Kukurahundi genocide, which was from 1982 to 1987.
At State House in Harare, two men who once fought together against Ian Smith's government sat down to end their bitter feud of the past 5 years. Under Mugabe's leadership, Zimbabwe is becoming a one-party socialist state. Mugabe was thought keen to complete this deal before taking over as president on New Year's Eve.
My years growing up were happy years in the sense that there was food and you found this abundance, but there was always this underlying fear, this underlying resentment, and always an insistence not to talk about the past. So the past became this thing that we ran away from with the idea that by not talking or looking back at the past, we could have a brighter future. But you'd see the rifts between Shona and Ndebele ethnic tensions, between, I remember when I first asked my mother about Kukurahundi when I was researching House of Stone, she froze, right?
And I think you need to explain there just exactly what Kukurahundi was. And also the fact that Zimbabwe basically is made up of two different ethnic groups. And the Shona people have traditionally always run the government.
Yes. Oh. So Kukurahundi was a government-sponsored genocide or massacre in Matabeleland. These were Shona-speaking soldiers who came into Matabeleland and were terrorizing the people there because the people supported Joshua Nkomo, a different party leader from the then President Mugabe. And so that was actually the start. What we see ZANU-PF doing now started then. And so there's been a confusion, I think, in Zimbabwe between state-sponsored violence and ethnic rivalries, right? The two became merged. And because of that, there's been resentment in Matabeleland of the more dominant Mashonaland. I think Mashonaland makes up 92% of the ethnic formation in the country, while Ndebele makes up about 8%.
And of course, the Ndebeles in Zimbabwe are more affiliated with Zulu Xhosa in South Africa.
Yes. So there's that tension of not really being seen as not belonging to Zimbabwe, right? And so the genocide tore families apart. But what was really most traumatic about it was that people were not allowed to talk about it, to talk about their trauma, to acknowledge what had happened. And so you have these scars that are festering even up to today.
The violence, the people that went in were a group called 5th Brigade from Zimbabwe. Now, they were trained notoriously by North Korean troops. And so you can only imagine the brutality. And still bodies are being found dumped down in mine shafts. People just disappeared. We don't know what happened to so many people.
Mr. Mugabe's notorious 5th Brigade has only been filmed once at this passing out parade in 1983. It's exclusively Shona speaking, unquestionably loyal to the Prime Minister, and has been trained by instructors from North Korea.
Mobilizing a large number of... I would like to pay tribute to our comrades in arms, the instructors from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, who, with the assistance of instructors from our own Zimbabwe National Army.
Some of them, they just shoot, some of them, they beat them until they die. Then they just, you light you off the fire, then you burn until you die. If I remember now, my heart is so painful.
And it's shocking when you look at the history, how we have this layer in Matabeleland of so-called happiness, this idea of not talking about the past as a way to move on. When you really dig into it, it becomes, for me, a really gruesome and horrific past. And you see people living with this trauma. It's an ongoing, unresolved trauma that manifests in many, from mental health to physical ailments.
And the reason, of course, we're talking about this is it does come up in your book. You were saying when you mention Gukuruhundi to your mother, how she reacts.
She froze. I remember she was cooking. When I asked about the Liberation War, she was more open. She was really letting me in. The moment I mentioned Gukuruhundi, she shut down. And that's when I knew there was something there. That's actually what sent me in search of that history. I felt there was a wound there. And that's what I went to try and figure out in House of Stone.
Now, tell us about your development there, because at some point you did leave Zimbabwe.
I wrote House of Stone first in South Africa. I had a draft in South Africa, but I finished it at the Iowa Writers' Workshop in the USA.
Now, you are skipping out the fact that you were pretending to go to college.
I see you've really delved into my bio. I guess I was a little bit of a delinquent in my younger years. I was studying architecture in Zimbabwe, but I would skip classes and go to the city centre and write. And this was me trying to figure out, what are we? Where are we? What is happening in Zimbabwe? And that carried on when I moved to South Africa for school. And then finally, I got to live my dream. I was at the Iowa Writers' Workshop pursuing writing. I will tell you the interesting thing there was all the books on history, on Zimbabwe's pre-independence writers that I could not find in Zimbabwe were in the University of Iowa's library. That was a great shock to me. So that period for me really helped me delve into that history. That distance from Zimbabwe helped me write that history as though it would not be read by the powers that be, right? It gave me the permission to be as honest and as thorough as I could be.
Tell us about House of Stone.
House of Stone is set in 2007. And there's a young man called Zamani who's in search of his history. For me, this is actually a metaphor of the born frees looking for their history, trying to find out what happened as a way to move forward. And so Zamani is rewriting history, believes that by going to the past, he can forge a new future. And what he finds in the past is horrific and too much to bear for him, really. And so really, this is about a family, Zimbabweans struggling with the trauma both the Liberation War and Gugurahundi. This is a country coming of age, really. That for me was what this novel was about. When I got to the end, for me, Zamani is a character, someone who's in search of his history, who's both a victim and victimizer, because he exerts violence on a family he's living with as a way to extract that history, is a metaphor for Zimbabwe, right? We have imbibed that violence, and we exude that violence on one another. Tsitsi Tangarimba said that we always say we're a happy people, but yet when we're laughing, there's a lot of pain there. There's a lot of trauma there. And I think that's true.
It's so interesting because just going back to when we met in Washington, one of the key speakers there was Viet Thanh Nguyen, and he is Vietnamese American. And he was talking about the fact that he could be either perpetrator or victim. And I think that applies here.
That applies here. Viet Thanh Nguyen's work, when I was actually writing, House Done on Memory, has a lovely book on memory and rememory, on forgetting and remembering, actually helped me think through this idea of being both perpetrator and victim. Yes.
And it's a very morally bizarre ground to occupy, isn't it?
It is. And for me, this is the benefit of closely looking and trying to be as truthful as you can about what you see, right? We always see ourselves as victims in Zimbabwe. I think it's time to have a conversation about both being victim and victimizer, to take responsibility for our country and our history.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, all right, here you are at Iowa. It is kind of life-changing for you.
Yes, no doubt.
And then?
And then House of Stone comes out in the UK first, actually, Atlantic Books, and that was a profound moment. It came out in the UK, and then Norton in the USA picked it up. And this book has taken me to different places with different audiences. I remember giving a talk at Oxford here. I remember just also having conversations with young Zimbabweans who had never discussed this history with their parents, and said after they read the book, they talked to their parents. And that was, for me, was profound. I remember in Oxford, there was a girl who stood up who was Shona, and said she was ashamed of being Shona because of that history. That was a painful moment for me, because I wanted her to understand. For me, going into the history, it wasn't a Shona versus Ndebele. It became that after the fact. It was state-sponsored violence. And I think for me, the real tragedy is that the Shona people, because we don't know our history, have actually been put in this position where they find they must defend this genocide, because it's the government has attached ethnic rivalry to this very specific event. And
as you say, it's not talked about in Zimbabwe, but it's also not really recognised or talked about much outside the country.
And that is really strange. You know, I'm thinking about how atrocities such as what happened in Rwanda, such as the Biafra War, are really a big thing, even here in Britain. I'm really a bit perplexed or not sure why Gugurahundi has been treated with such ambivalence.
And of course, a part of that was that it was almost impossible for the press to get in, for anybody to know.
Yes.
My brother, as you may remember, dressed up as a Catholic priest and went and travelled around Matabeleland and then published it all in the Sunday Times, which I think was the first time that it came to international attention. But it quickly just went away, because why is it Zimbabwe is just not that interesting to the rest of the world?
You know, I really do think Zimbabwe was touted as a success story. We all wanted Zimbabwe to succeed, and I think for a moment we were willing to sweep things under the rug. I think had that been a moment, and had that not recurred, we would not be here. And I think the problem is, I think of Gugurahundi as Zimbabwe's first sin, right? At independence, new country, and it keeps recurring, and that becomes the issue. Right?
Yeah.
And ZANU-PF developed this violent method that they now employ over and over again.
Let's talk about your new book. It's called Digging Stars, and it does pull on many of those themes. First of all, what's a digging star?
The digging star is called Pleiades. It's what's known as Pleiades here. And in Bulawayo, Matabeleland, in Ndebele, my language, it's known as Isilimela. And that's the translation to digging stars. So in September, it's the rural folk would use the stars to sort of know when to stop planting, when to prepare ground. And so I found that history, that astronomical history, that relationship with the stars very fascinating. So for me, it's a metaphor for the global nature of scientific knowledge.
And this book is very rooted in science. So tell us about the two main characters. It's the girl who's 11 and her father.
So Frank is an Ndebele astronomer who starts off in a rural Zimbabwe plum tree, gets a scholarship to America and flourishes. As a child, he has a talent for the stars. And then he's picked up by a Catholic priest who educates him. And then he goes off to America and he's now a famous astronomer. And Atandwa is his daughter who yearns to follow in her father's footsteps. I was really interested in legacy here, in the sense of continuity and how knowledge travels, transforms, and how that could be.
Now, it's complicated by the fact that her parents have split. Frank's in America without her mother, but he also has a new partner, and that partner has a child, and he becomes very important to the story.
Yes. So when Atandwa visits America for the first time, age 11, she finds this new family there. And it's an interesting moment. For me, I think it becomes... That's the defining moment for Atandwa, where I think she chooses her father over her mother. I think there's this interesting resentment or rejection of the mother figure throughout, and this yearning for this larger-than-life father figure. And for me, though, this is a metaphor, right? The father who is left and is soaring, and the mother who is weighed down by what Zimbabwe becomes.
Now, Atandwa also has mental health issues, but
Yes.
these are very much connected to that idea of inherited trauma.
Yes. I was trying to work through, in Zimbabwe, it feels like we don't have a language for our trauma. That's why it's a thing that's enacted, right? This idea that we laugh, we're jolly people, we're happy, but always, right, we're acting out this violence in various ways. And so for me, Atandwa's terrors, which are an anxiety disorder, but which are it's something I actually suffered from, and so that came from my life. It's called conversion disorder, right? And it comes from prolonged stress that's not dealt with and then manifests physically. For me, Atandwa is manifesting this generational trauma you talk about. So there's the immediate trauma that surrounds her regarding her father's death, but there's also the generational trauma that she learns or hears or experiences through Frank, who has his own trauma about the Kukurahundi genocide in Zimbabwe.
Another big theme of the book, and something that affects all Zimbabweans who've left, is this idea of adapting to a new place.
From being a born free is so hard because you grow up, and I remember in the 90s we were really thriving, and then you get to a point where you see your own parents suffering, regressing, and then it starts to feel as though there is no future or hope in Zimbabwe. Becomes this fear that if you stay, you will be sucked in. And Atandwa suffers from that. So this idea of leaving and being so willing to give oneself up to a new culture also has to do with the desire to thrive, right? To find... And so for me, even this commentary on leaving is also about the tragic cost that Zimbabwe has had on its generations, on its people. We're brilliant people without a place to cultivate us, and so we go and find roots in other lands.
Now, Atandwa, and I guess you too, because this does seem to be very, very closely mirroring your own life, also comes to terms with what it means to be American, but even more so what it means to be black, because she had never thought of herself as black before.
Yeah, so America has a very specific relationship to race. That's kind of actually being exported globally, and I don't know what to make of that. The experience of being black in other places such as Zimbabwe is so complicated by the fact that black as a race is a majority, and so there are other nuances to those identities. But I also do think Atandwa is also not willing to adopt blackness. I don't even think it's innocence, such as just a willful sense of denial, simply because one, it's not her experience, and two, it's a very traumatic also identity. You think of that generational trauma she's carrying. I see Atandwa as someone who's trying to protect herself. And whiteness as a concept, as something that carries privileges, is something that's really attractive to her, as it is to many Africans. Yeah. In America, there's a lot of tension between diasporic Africans and African Americans, and it comes from this misunderstanding of what each group is seeking in America and why.
And I just want to have a little insert there. For me, coming to Britain, I had never seen so many white people in my life. That was a big shock.
In Iowa, I will tell you, Georgina, when I first set foot, I kept looking around. I remember when I saw the first black person there, I stared at them unashamedly. It is a disconcerting feeling. The feeling of being a minority is really, really a shock. I'll tell you a brief funny story. I grew up among white Zimbabweans. I went to school with white Zimbabweans. In America, I had this disconcerting sense of being surrounded by whiteness, to the point that at grad school parties, I'd start touching white people's hair, doing a little ethnographic. It was just a really discombobulating experience.
Yeah. It's extraordinary how much race influences things, but I'm really keen for people who do not come from a majority black African country to understand what that means to us. It's very difficult to put it into words, and for people to understand what our relationship between black and white, I mean, within that country, how that works.
And how it's a very different relationship. I remember when I went to Zimbabwe last year, I was in Harare and had drinks with some white Zimbabwean friends. It's a very different experience. And it's hard to explain to Americans, both white and black, the nuances of race in a country, in a place like Zimbabwe. Of course, race has been big in our history in the last 20 years, but just the way that history formed us is very, very different. It's very, very different.
We are out of time, Novuyo, which I am so sorry about because there's so much more we could discuss. And I've very purposefully not really gone into the plot of Digging Stars because I really want people to read it. And within it, you really explore some of these themes that we've brought up. So I highly recommend you this book. It's called Digging Stars. It's published by Norton. The paperback edition is about to come out. And so that is available. Please do support your independent bookshop by getting that, or shop online at bookshop.org. Novuyo Rosa Tshuma, thank you very much indeed for coming on the show.
I feel like I could talk to you for hours, so thank you, Georgina.
Well, we'll go and do that after the show. You've been listening to Meet the Writers, thanks to the production team of Steph Chungu, Sana Jamani and Mariella Bevan. And you can download this show and previous episodes from our website or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.